Hi, I'm Ed Sperling. I'm the editor-in-chief of Semiconductor Engineering. I'm over at Lam Research with David Freed, who's going to talk today about advanced process control. So, David, why should the industry be thinking about advanced process control? What should they worry about?
I think the industry has always worried about advanced process control, but as we get to the more advanced technologies, the more scaled technology generations, what we're seeing is that the tolerances are starting to dominate the problems. The tolerances or the margins or the ranges of different structural specs are starting to become a larger portion of actual target dimensions.
Is this because the dielectrics are thinning out, the spaces between the wires is thinner?
I think what we're seeing now is as dimensions get smaller, structures get smaller, films get thinner, the physical reasons for variation aren't scaling along with those dimensions. So as an example, as photoresist and lithography scales down to smaller and smaller and smaller lines, the actual molecules in the photoresist aren't much smaller, and so variations that come from molecular effects in the resist become a larger part of the actual target dimension.
Why don't you draw this out for us?
Okay, I'll try.
So what are we looking at here?
Okay, so this is a very, very simple description, but if you think about silicon, a bulk silicon wafer, and you have an oxide film that you've just deposited on it. When we think about drawing structure, we would just draw an oxide layer. But as the dimensions scale down smaller and smaller and smaller, this oxide is really composed of silicon and oxide, and there's some dimension to that. And if I were to draw what that looked like, they would stack up in an arrangement like this. Now, silicon oxide is amorphous, but you actually have some amount of material there. And so now, as you start to think about what the variations look like, if there's material sticking out, it's not this simple planar thickness that you would assume from drawing a block diagram. There's actually some pretty big differences in the thickness if I look at different points on this. Okay? All I'm trying to show here is that the actual material, the atomic or the molecular effects within the material and the variations are causing pretty significant differences across the nominal dimension.
And there are a lot of things that can affect that too, right? The purity of the materials, how it's deposited, the roughness on the edges of the lines as well.
Absolutely. So in this particular example, the state of the silicon surface before you deposit this oxide or grow this oxide is a big effect. The deposition technique, if it's a thermal growth versus a deposition, versus atomic layer deposition. The deposition technique, the quality of the material being used, those all have dramatic effects on this variation I'm talking about.
How do you track that, and can you track that in real time, and what impact does this have on the entire wafer yield, the longevity of how long these chips actually work in the market?
Okay, it's a great question. There's a couple different ways to, as you say, track this in real time. You can either track what's happening in the piece of equipment that's doing the deposition from equipment level sensors, or you can actually track what's going on the wafer. Those are two very, very different types of measurement or tracking, and they all have implications into advanced process control.
So in real terms, what's the impact of this?
In real terms, basically, when you're designing a new technology, when you're planning out the next scale technology generation, you have to account for the full range of the variation that could happen here. And again, that variation comes from multiple different sources. But as you start to plan your technology and you start to pile on top all of these different variations, this is just one. If you pile all these variations on top of each other, you end up with a very, very large range of total performance. Most of the chip designers out there will tell you their product is really only as fast as the slowest transistors out there. So if I have to plan a technology with a big range of performance, it actually hurts the product performance at the end of the day.
In the past, when we had variation, it was typically one thing that set things off. Now you have lots of sources of variation. Are they additive?
Sometimes they're additive, sometimes they actually compensate. But as the process flows have gotten more and more complicated, as we've gone from single patterning to double patterning, quad patterning, as the devices have gone from planar to 3 dimensions, how these variations interact with one another is getting more and more complex. And the ability to predict the final structural variation relative to all these individual process variations has gotten nearly impossible.
And we have variation coming from equipment, we have it from materials and new materials as well. We have it from the handling of the wafers. You have all sorts of different things that can possibly go wrong here, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's sort of macro scale differences, right? It's the different wafer, different environment, but then there's micro scale, like during the process. In this example, one oxide molecule, lands in the wrong spot during a deposition process. So there's variations from the macro all the way down to the micro scale. They all contribute.
More sensors are being put into the equipment as the manufacturing is occurring. It's producing a lot more data. That data is not necessarily consistent. There's an enormous amount, more than people could ever use. What do we do with that, and how do we sort through it?
Okay, so the first problem, exactly like you said, the data is very unstructured, and it's not all the same type of data, the same form of data coming off the same sensors. So the very first part of this problem is this data needs to be extracted from the equipment in a way that is taggable, searchable, and has the context available on that data so that it can become useful. The example I would say is just a flow control sensor versus some RF sensor on a piece of equipment. They're different sensors, they're sampling at different rates, they're producing different data, but all of that data becomes important, and I need to get that together. In addition, as I said, these process flows and integration schemes are so complex, I need to get the data from different equipment, doing different processes, often from different manufacturers, to come together in the same place. And so a lot of the manufacturing companies and the fab teams are managing the situation along with the equipment suppliers to provide this data into what's called a data lake in the right format, in the right context, and make it accessible to the types of data operations we're looking to perform.
Is it accessible fast enough to actually be able to use that to adjust a process as it's happening, or is this all after the fact?
Okay, it depends on the process control scheme. So the answer is yes. Some of these control schemes and some of the data needs to happen in the chamber or at the tool. And so you can't depend on extracting that data, pumping it up to the fab host, having it go into the data lake, and then turn around and actually alter the process as it's happening. There's just too much latency in that system. So some of the data has to remain resident at the equipment and be processed at the equipment for control. Some of the data can be pulled maybe one step off the equipment to a in-fab server to process and then control data or control the system. Other data is going to be pushed to the data lake and controlling process later. So it typically is talking about runtime control versus feedback control, wafer-based feedback control, lot-based feedback control, or feed-forward control. The latency in each of those control schemes will determine how far that data has to transit away from the equipment.
How much human interaction is there with this data? Is there time for a person to step in and actually do something, or is this all machine-to-machine type of reaction?
I think the answer to that question depends on the phase of the life cycle of a given technology. So when you're in a research and development and maybe early pilot mode of a technology, there can be some human intervention and some human analysis of this data. But the entire nature of advanced or automated process control is to put systems in place, algorithms in place, and compute environments in place to take the human intervention out of this problem. When this gets to high volume manufacturing, it all has to be computerized, automated, and no human interaction.
One of the problems that has occurred in the fab, particularly at advanced nodes, is you have a fall off as you get to the edge of the wafer. It's not the same as it is in the middle of the wafer, and your yield is going to be different. Can this kinds of sensors actually improve that?
Okay, so to make improvements like that, you really need three things. Okay, to make any automated process control scheme work, you need three things. One is, can I measure the problem at a rate and frequency fast enough to adjust for it? Two, do I have a computing or an algorithm technique to make a correction? And three, is there a capability in the equipment to correct for it? All three of those have to be there for a control scheme. So when you talk about the edge of the wafer, I'll answer it. Can you measure it? Absolutely. There's plenty of measurement techniques that'll get that data and understand the problem at the edge. Can we compute for a compensating parameter? Yes, those are well-known algorithms and compute techniques. One of the challenges is making an equipment level adjustment based on that information. Here at Lam Research, we have adjustable edge rings in the etch chambers in order to change the etch behavior near the edge of the wafer. It's extremely powerful in improving process behavior at the extreme edge of the wafer.
Does it get worse at 3 and 5 nanometers? We're now at 7, just starting to develop test chips at 5.
Absolutely. Process controls get much worse as you scale generations. Part of it is this problem, where the films get thinner, so the number of atoms in those films or the number of resist molecules in those lines becomes smaller, and therefore variations become larger. It also becomes more challenging at these nodes because the complex integration flows and the complex resulting structure gives rise to more impact from those variations.
Also at 5 nanometers, 3 nanometers, the chips are getting larger. There's a lot more steps that go into them as well, right? So now you have more possible things that can go wrong, more sources of variation. How do we deal with that?
Okay, so there's a few different ways. Again, one of the ways that's near and dear to my heart is predictive modeling. As these flows get more complicated, and as you said, more steps, more complex flows, more variations, the interaction between those variations gets harder to map out in simple ways. So using predictive process modeling to understand those compensation and exaggeration schemes between these variations is absolutely essential to plan the processes. Also, measurement. You have to measure and understand what's happening on the wafer if you're going to make corrections in the fab. Now, often measurement can be quite expensive and time-consuming during the process. You have to send wafers to standalone offline metrology, and often manufacturers are using reduced sampling rates, so they'll only check a few wafers in a lot and only a few points on a few wafers in a lot to make really important judgments about process quality. So one of the things that's really interesting is trying to take the tool control signals, the sensors on the equipment, and use that in a very intelligent way to predict what the structure on the wafer would look like and what the metrology would be if we measured it.
These chips are also spending more time in the fab as well. Does that afford you more opportunity to do more with it, or does it just complicate things even further?
Actually, as the integration flows get longer and longer and longer, fab throughput goes down, right? And so the time you get to make extra measurements actually reduces. There's more and more pressure to remove time that the wafers aren't actually being processed. So actually, I think it goes the other way.
So given all this, how far down can we extend the current processes? We've been hearing about 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer. Are we really talking about 1.5 nanometer? Is it likely, or are we going in some other direction?
I think there's a significant length of time we can continue scaling technologies. The names of these technologies, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, 1 nanometer, they mean very, very little anymore, the actual nanometer designation. But each of these nodes has to provide a competitive cost scaling advantage for the products. I think we have a significant runway to continue that if we focus on the core challenges that each technology brings.
We've been managing this pretty well in the past. What happens if we get a lot more aggressive with this, which is really what we have to do in order to move down to these nodes, right?
Yeah, so if you look historically, we've been okay at managing variation at this scale that variation impacted technology. Everybody's very quick to talk about how lithography has scaled generations, but actually each of these generations, that scaling has to have been enabled by some other fundamental technical innovation. And the example I like to talk about is Rapid thermal anneals, when we developed spike anneals and laser anneals, what that let us do is it let us shrink the transistor junctions. We made more abrupt junctions, it shrunk the junctions, it allowed us to build a smaller transistor. And then lithography made us pack them tighter together. So that lithographic scaling was enabled by ultra-fast anneals. So now, today, we look around and the number of those technology innovations, those fundamental innovations, that list is getting very small. So we're doing bigger and more challenging transistor architecture changes to get scaling generations. I believe that if we took an aggressive stance against a bunch of these different variations, we could probably scale technology and achieve cost scaling advantages without these massive architectural changes like gate-all-around and CFET and things like that.
So these are lots of steps, though, right? I mean, it's not just one step that you're taking like we did in the past. It's lots of individual steps.
Absolutely. So this is, I think, what makes it quite challenging to recognize or realize these benefits. When we changed to ultra-fast anneals, we made a single process change. We adjusted a number of other processes to take advantage of it. If we're going to try to scale technology through variation reduction, it is going to require a maniacal focus on many, many contributing processes. And it's going to be a lot of very small steps to the end goal rather than individual large steps in technology development.
So what you're really doing is getting rid of the margin in the process, right?
Yeah, we're getting rid of the margins in a lot of processes. So maybe let me draw this out for you.
Sure.
If we think back to a planar CMOS technology generation, really a lot of your scaling was defined by the fact that you would have a gate with some spacers, you would have a source drain, and you would have a contact on either side. Okay? The pitch, the tightest pitch you could lay out transistors was really defined right here by this structure. And to define this tightest pitch, you had to worry about the gate length, you had to worry about a space between the gate and the contact to the source drain, we'll call this space, and you basically had to worry about half of a contact here and the other half over here. So about one contact width. That set your minimum pitch. But of course, with all of the variations, you really had to worry about the gate length plus its variation, a space plus its variation, and the contact plus its variation. Here's where you can fundamentally make technology scaling benefits. If you just cut down on all those variations, you can define the technology at tighter pitches.
And this has to print right, too, which is one of the problems that's been there in the past, right? It's been pretty loose in terms of how things actually get printed. The shapes are not exactly as you expect them to be.
Yes, everything, of course, has to be printed correctly. The argument I'm making here is actually just effectively a one-dimensional argument. And so this is still just lines and spaces. Lines and spaces you can make very, very dense, especially with double, quad, or even octo patterning techniques that have been developed today. So as I said previously, lithography or patterning maybe gets the credit for all the technology scaling, but that shrink has to be enabled by innovation, either by shrinking physical components of the device or by reducing the tolerance on all of them.
So if you get this all right, if everything works as you're saying, what happens?
If everything works properly, if we can cut the variation of the gate length down, if we can cut the variation of this space down, if we can cut the variation of the contact down, I am able to define the technology at a tighter pitch. I've just bought myself scaling essentially without making a major architectural change to the transistor.
So how does this tie back into process control?
Each one of these variations in the structural measurements of this transistor, the variations arise from variations in individual processes. Now, understanding which are the key contributing processes and how to control them is essential. And then attacking each one of those processes with additional sensors, additional control schemes, additional capabilities on the equipment to adjust process, and the computational environment to make those adjustments is key to driving overall reduction in the final structure.
David Fried, thanks for a great explanation.
Thank you very much, Ed.